A bell tolled in the dead of night, though no rope hung to pull it, and no soul was seen within the tower. Whispers of a vanished child and a haunted sanctuary drift through a fog-choked village where fear walks in daylight and silence hides a secret passage. What if the sound meant something more than dread? Something deliberate? Something dark? Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was on a bleak November afternoon that I found myself once more seated in our familiar lodgings at Baker Street, the fire emitting a reluctant flicker as it fought the chill seeping through the London fog. The air was thick with the scent of damp wool and coal smoke, and the silence of our rooms was broken only by the occasional crackle of the coals and the turning of a page in Holmes's chair across from mine. He had not spoken in some time. Sherlock Holmes sat as motionless as a statue, his long fingers steepled under his chin, eyes half-lidded, but his mind, of that I had no doubt, was alert and churning. It was in these moods that Holmes seemed most formidable, for I knew from experience that this stillness was but the tension of the bowstring before the arrow's flight. Outside, the street below was rendered ghost-like by the mist. From time to time, a carriage rattled past, its lamps blurred and spectral, and once a newspaper boy called out half-heartedly into the murk, his voice swallowed before it reached the upper windows. There was a curious pressure in the atmosphere, as though the very air awaited something. It was on such a day that fate once again placed a strange and terrible case upon Holmes's doorstep, one as haunting in its quiet horror as any we had yet encountered. I had just reached for the teapot to pour myself a second cup when Holmes stirred and fixed his gaze upon the reflection within the china's curved surface. "Ah," he said suddenly. "An ex-military man of middling rank, recently returned from India, and presently involved in some matter of personal inheritance." I paused, my cup in hand. "Holmes, surely—" He raised a finger and gestured to the window. "Observe, Watson, not the man himself, but the shadow of him, cast in the curvature of your teacup. You see the smear of clay on the left heel of his boot? Bengal mud, distinctly redder than our English earth, and no rain this week would produce such wetness unless he had stepped from a cellar or garden recently watered. But how do you know? The stiffness of his gait, his stance, military, his moustache, trim but greying, an officer of some age. As for inheritance, I deduced it from the folded paper in his breast pocket. A legal envelope, barely concealed but clearly sealed afresh. And look again. His hand trembles slightly. He is not nervous but expectant. The combination, my dear Watson, is elementary." I approached the window and indeed observed the man below, middle-aged, erect in posture, though his shoulders bore a faint stoop. He was glancing about with cautious purpose, as if debating whether to ascend our steps. Yet before he could reach our door, he was drawn away by a shout across the street and turned, vanishing once more into the fog. "You see," Holmes murmured, settling back with a thin smile. "The world leaves its fingerprints upon the observant eye. One need only care to look." No sooner had he said this than a sharp knock sounded at the door. It was Mrs. Hudson who brought in the envelope, her eyebrows raised slightly as she handed it to me. "For you, Doctor," she said, and withdrew with the silent efficiency to which we had long been accustomed. The handwriting on the front bore a familiarity that stirred something half forgotten in my mind. I opened it and scanned the contents, my brow furrowing as I read. "My dear Holmes," I said slowly, "this is from Samuel Arkwright, a fellow I knew at school. He took holy orders some years ago and now serves as vicar in a parish called Darnley Hollow." Holmes said nothing but inclined his head. "He writes with considerable urgency. It appears his church bell, long out of use and missing its rope, has begun ringing of its own accord. Not once, but on several successive nights, always at midnight. The bell tower is sealed. No one claims to have entered it, yet the villagers swear to hearing it toll. Holmes's eyes narrowed. There is more, I continued. On the night of the first tolling, a girl from the village disappeared. Arkwright fears some sinister agency at work. Perhaps someone is using superstition to mask more worldly motives. He begs our assistance. Holmes reached for the letter and read it through in silence. At length, he placed it upon the table and rose from his chair with a gleam in his eye. A bell that rings without a rope, a vanished girl, and a vicar trembling with dread, he said. Watson, I believe the fog has lifted. The door had scarcely closed behind Mrs. Hudson when the bell was rung again, this time more insistently. Holmes, still standing beside the hearth with Arkwright's letter in hand, turned his head slightly, a faint flicker of anticipation passing over his features. Moments later, our landlady returned, ushering in a figure who paused just inside the threshold, his hat clutched tightly in gloved hands. Samuel Arkwright, I exclaimed, rising to greet him. By heaven, it's been, 20 years. The man who stood before us had changed considerably from the earnest-eyed scholar I remembered. His clerical collar seemed to sit uneasily upon a frame gaunt with strain, and the deep lines at the corners of his mouth bespoke sleeplessness and anxiety. He returned my greeting with a weary smile, then turned to Holmes. Mr. Holmes, he said, I am not ashamed to say I come to you in fear, grave fear, for the safety of my parish and the soul of a missing child. Holmes inclined his head with grave courtesy. You have come to the right place, Mr. Arkwright. Pray sit. You shall tell us everything from the beginning. And so began a tale as strange and disquieting as any we had ever heard. The vicar seated himself slowly, as though the act of lowering his frame carried some unspoken burden. He removed his gloves with trembling fingers and folded them carefully in his lap. I serve, he began, at St. Eligius, a modest church in the village of Darnley Hollow. It is a remote place, untouched by the modern roar of rail or gaslight. The air is thick with soil, and the stones remember what the people try to forget. There is little there save the church, the inn, and the fears that gather when the sun sets early. He paused to draw a breath. Our bell, an old bronze relic from the 15th century, was long ago rendered unusable. Its pull rope frayed and broke some years back, and the bell itself has remained still since. No one has dared the climb to the tower in years, yet 4 nights ago, precisely at the stroke of midnight, the bell tolled. Holmes's gaze sharpened, but he remained silent. It rang again the next night, and again. No one has seen anyone enter the tower. The doors remain bolted, and the ladder up to the bell platform is in such decay that it would scarcely support a child's weight, let alone an adult's. Here, the vicar's voice dropped. The sound it makes is not that of joy or solemnity. It is a tolling that chills the marrow, a cry, as it were, from something buried and forgotten. Holmes turned his head slightly. And what of the villagers? Arkwright's eyes darkened. That, Mr. Holmes, is where my trouble deepens. The bell alone would have stirred unease, Arkwright continued. But in Darnley Hollow, old fears lie shallow beneath the soil. He leaned forward slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. There is an ancient tale, known by most but spoken by few, the legend of the monk of Darnley. According to village law, a monk once committed a sacrilege within the church, a betrayal of such gravity that he was entombed alive within the bell tower's foundation. Since then, it is said, he returns when the church forgets its oaths. Holmes's brow furrowed. And you believe this tale is being used to manipulate the townsfolk? I do not yet know what I believe, the vicar admitted, but the effect is undeniable. They are frightened, Mr. Holmes. Some will no longer attend services. Others have refused to let their children out after dark. I even had a man, a lifelong member of the parish council, insist that the bell was sounding as a divine warning. Watson's voice, quiet with concern, broke in. Has anyone attempted to investigate the tower itself? Twice, Arkwright replied grimly. Once by myself, once by a farmhand I paid handsomely. In both cases, we were driven back by sounds, strange, metallic echoes from within. I am not a man given to superstition, Doctor, but I fear something, or someone, is using our past to shroud the present in darkness. It was then, with evident reluctance, that the vicar leaned back and fixed his eyes upon the floor. On the night the bell first rang, he said, a girl disappeared. The room fell utterly still. Her name is Alice Turner, 14 years of age. Her family lives on the edge of the village near the Old Mill Road. She was last seen walking home from the vicarage after an evening lesson with my housekeeper's daughter. That was 3 nights past. She never arrived. I felt a chill pass over me. A search was conducted, of course, he continued. Thorough and immediate. No trace, not a torn ribbon, not a footmark. Nothing save a single set of footprints, halted mid-path, as if the earth had swallowed her whole. Since then, others claim to have heard footsteps near the tower, or to have seen movement in the windows. And the authorities? I asked. I appealed to the local constable. He is a practical man, but... Arkwright hesitated. He, too, has grown withdrawn. His wife swears she heard chanting in the nave the night following Alice's disappearance. Holmes stood at last, the firelight casting sharp shadows upon his face. I believe, Reverend, it is time we visited your bell. There was a pause in which even the wind seemed to retreat from the glass. Holmes moved toward the hearth and stood with his back to us, hands clasped behind him. There are moments, he said quietly, when logic and fear brush hands in passing, moments that invite mischief and murder beneath the veil of folklore. He turned. Watson, we depart tomorrow. Reverend, I trust you will make the necessary arrangements. We shall require access to your church, and I would ask that nothing be disturbed between now and our arrival. Arkwright exhaled with visible relief. You have my deepest gratitude, Mr. Holmes. Holmes merely inclined his head. Do not thank me yet. There is a bell without a rope, a missing child, and a village on the edge of hysteria. I intend to discover what string it is that has truly been pulled. And with that, the case, though we scarcely yet knew it, was begun. We departed the following morning beneath a ceiling of low grey cloud that seemed to press the very air to the ground. The train, though punctual, made slow progress as we wound southward into the heart of Kent. The landscape grew steadily more rural, hedgerows giving way to damp woods and fields sodden from the rains of recent weeks. Holmes sat opposite me in the compartment, his gaze fixed on the motionless countryside beyond the window, though I suspected his mind was several steps ahead, already walking the nave of St. Eligius. I, for my part, found my thoughts returning often to the vicar's ashen face and the strange, mournful tolling of a bell long thought silent. You observed the inconsistency in Arkwright's account, I presume, Holmes said at length, without shifting his gaze. I confess I did not, I replied. He struck me as wholly sincere. Sincerity and accuracy, my dear Watson, are often strangers to one another. He claims the bell rope was removed years ago, yet speaks of the tower doors as bolted. Why bolt what cannot be accessed? And then there is the ladder, long decayed. Yet someone, or something, is clearly reaching that bell. He tapped his long fingers together. There is a mechanism at work here, of that I am certain, but whether it is of metal or of mind, I cannot yet say. As the train hissed to a halt at a lonely platform, we stepped out into the clammy breath of Darnley Hollow and the mystery that awaited us. The village of Darnley Hollow was the very image of pastoral melancholy. A cluster of crooked chimneys and weather-stained cottages stood huddled against the chill, their stone walls streaked with moss and lichen. Fog lingered even past noon, clinging low to the hedgerows and the fields beyond. We were met at the station by Arkwright himself, his countenance no less grave than before. He led us without delay to the church, a structure older than memory and marked by centuries of wear. Its Gothic frame loomed against the colourless sky, the bell tower rising like a dark finger above the square. Ivy coiled around its edges, and the narrow lancet windows stared out like mournful eyes. Holmes paused before the great oak doors and ran his hand along the iron fittings. "No sign of recent force," he murmured. Inside, the nave was dim, the air heavy with cold incense and the must of age. We proceeded in silence up the central aisle, our footsteps echoing upon the stone. The chancel was modest, but the altar, simple, carved in dark wood, showed signs of use. And yet there was something unnatural in the way dust had settled about the space. Holmes moved ahead, his eye taking in each detail with deliberate calm. At the base of the bell tower, a door stood secured by a rusted padlock. The ladder beyond was indeed warped, its rungs brittle and bowed. No man in his right mind would attempt to scale it. Holmes said nothing for some time, only knelt and examined the stonework near the altar, with growing interest. "There is more to this than superstition," he said at last. "The church is old, but someone has disturbed it recently, and not for prayer." Holmes beckoned me wordlessly and gestured to the stones near the foot of the altar. At first glance, they appeared no different from the rest, ancient flagstones worn smooth by centuries of passing feet. But as he drew from his pocket a small magnifying lens and bent low, I too saw the faint scuffing. "Scrape marks," he said quietly. "Not old. Within the month, certainly. Something heavy has been dragged or placed here, and repeatedly." He shifted slightly, his gaze drifting up toward the space above the altar. There, on the adjacent wall and upon the edge of the communion rail, I observed it. Hardened rivulets of wax, long since dried to a sickly yellow. "And here," Holmes said, pointing with his cane, "note the outline left by a candle base. Wax drips down, but not upward. Someone has knelt here with a candle more than once." I stepped forward and caught the faintest acrid trace in the air. An odour like burnt soap or spoiled fruit. "Lye," Holmes confirmed. "Or a close compound. Used in cleaning, or more crudely, to conceal stronger scents. Curious." He rose and swept his gaze across the empty pews. "There is purpose in every disturbance, Watson. One must ask, what is being concealed beneath this altar, and what ceremony is being conducted in its shadow?" The silence of the place pressed in around us once more, as if the walls themselves held their breath. Holmes crossed to the far side of the chancel, where a collection of ecclesiastical implements had been set aside: wooden stands, chalice trays, and a pair of iron candle holders. He lifted one of them delicately and turned it in his hands. "This one," he said. "Note the difference?" I examined both. One was layered thick with dust and faint corrosion, as one would expect. The other, though aged in form, was oddly pristine. The iron gleamed faintly in the light, as though it had been scrubbed with vigour. "No dust, no soot in the cup," Holmes observed. "And see here, a trace of wax, but far fresher than the other. Someone attempted to clean this thoroughly, though imperfectly." He set the item down and stood in silence for a moment, eyes half-lidded. The effort to clean a single object while leaving the rest untouched betrays a nervous hand. It suggests urgency, not reverence, perhaps even guilt. A low creak sounded in the nave beyond, but it was only the timbers settling in the cold. Holmes turned toward the vestry. Let us continue, Watson. Every relic and every stain here whispers of recent use, and I do not believe in ghostly monks. Holmes turned once more to the base of the tower, where the locked door loomed like a sentinel of secrets long buried. The iron padlock, though aged, had been freshly oiled, and as Holmes ran his fingers along its curve, he gave a slight nod. Not used often, he murmured, but neither wholly neglected. He produced a measuring tape and began to examine the wear along the hinge brackets. The rust here is deceptive, he said, indicating a streak of faint abrasion at the lower hinge. Note the tiny flakes on the floor, a recent movement, perhaps within the last fortnight. Someone has entered, though not by force. The stone arch around the door was likewise examined, Holmes tracing with his fingers the faint outline where a long-forgotten lintel had been disturbed. The very dust about the base lay in strange patterns, as though briefly lifted and resettled. Too narrow for typical use, Holmes observed of the winding interior stair glimpsed through the crack, yet wide enough for one who knows its shape. There is something almost monastic in its restraint. He stepped back in thought, then glanced upward. Let us speak with those who live beneath the bell's shadow. The stones have told part of the tale. Now let us hear what the living have to say. Our next stop was the King's Barleycorn, the lone public house of Darnley Hollow, whose thatched roof had bowed under the weight of centuries, and whose common room still bore the scent of old ale and peat smoke. Behind the counter stood Mrs. Lark, a stout, ruddy-cheeked woman with a tongue as quick as her hands. Her eyes narrowed slightly as we entered, but widened when she recognized Holmes. "Mr. Arkwright sent you, didn't he?" she asked, drying a mug with vigorous motion. "About the bell?" Holmes gave a courteous nod. "Only to observe, madam, but your perspective would be most valuable." She snorted. "Aye, well, you'll hear no sense from the men. They're either afraid or drunk, or both. But mark my words, that church is cursed. Been wrong ever since they sealed the reliquary." "The reliquary?" I inquired. "Aye," she said, lowering her voice. "An old relic, they say, locked in the vestry decades ago. Some say it brought plague, others that it was stolen from a murdered monk. But ask around. Ever since it vanished, that bell's been quiet. Until now." Holmes leaned slightly forward. "And do you believe in the monk, madam?" She looked us both over and shrugged. "Don't have to. But I believe in what fear does to folk. And fear's rising again." Holmes offered a slow nod of thanks. "Useful indeed, Mrs. Lark. Very useful." Outside, the wind seemed colder than before. As we departed the inn, a small figure darted from the alley between the bakehouse and the green. He halted before us, wide-eyed and trembling. "You're the detective, ain't you?" he said, staring up at Holmes. "That is one name I answer to," Holmes replied gently. The boy swallowed. "I saw him. On the third night. The monk." Holmes knelt slowly. "Tell me what you saw." "He glowed," the boy whispered, "like moonlight through smoke. Was standing atop the tower. Then he vanished." "Did he move? Make a sound?" The boy shook his head fiercely. "Just looked down. Right at me." Holmes studied him for a long moment, then placed a hand on the child's shoulder. "Thank you. You've been very brave." As the boy ran off, Holmes turned to me. "A child's eyes may see clearly, but fear paints strange colours. Yet we must account for every testimony, however spectral it may seem." We next found ourselves at the edge of the village, where a crumbling cottage leaned against a stone wall like an old man in repose. Elias Whitaker, once caretaker of St. Eligius, received us with suspicion but relented when Holmes presented our purpose. He was a wiry figure, the years having etched themselves into every crease of his face. "They said I was too old," he muttered, motioning us inside. Too slow to guard the Lord's house. Holmes, ever gentle with wounded pride, asked, "You served how many years, Mr. Whitaker?" 45, he said proudly. "Knew every brick in that church, and the tower, aye, that too." "Tell me," Holmes said, "is there truth in the tale of the sealed passage beneath the altar?" Whitaker's eyes flickered. "Old monks had a way to the tower without climbing, used it during the plague, when they buried the sick in haste. And that way remains? It was walled up, but walls weaken." As we rose to leave, he added bitterly, "That bell never rang while I kept it. Now it tolls for fools and ghosts." Outside, Holmes lit his pipe. Whitaker's pride is wounded, but not his memory. We must search for a forgotten path. Our final call that day was the Turner household, a modest dwelling on the fringe of the village, marked by silence more than sorrow. Mr. and Mrs. Turner received us with the hollow courtesy of those drained by grief. She was quiet, the mother said, her eyes rimmed red. But lately, frightened. Said someone had been watching her after choir. Holmes listened intently. "Did she mention who?" Mrs. Turner shook her head. "Only that she heard steps where there should have been none." "She wore a silver locket," added the father, "from her grandmother. Found her scarf the morning after, but the locket was gone." Holmes's face grew unreadable. "The scarf, where?" "Near the boundary wall of the churchyard." As we took our leave, Holmes paused at the gate, his gaze returning to the steeple, now barely visible in the gathering dusk. "The loss of a child," he said softly, "strikes deeper than the blade. But grief need not remain blind. We shall see, Watson. We shall see." And with that, the last light of the day faded behind the fog, and we turned back toward the church that stood at the centre of it all. As the days passed, it became apparent that the mystery surrounding the midnight bell had taken hold of the village mind like a fever. Whispers passed in hushed tones across market stalls and at cottage doors. Even in broad daylight, the people of Darnley Hollow walked with eyes averted from the church spire, as though some invisible noose hung above it. The tale of the monk of Darnley grew by the hour. Some said they had seen a figure gliding across the churchyard, face obscured by a cowl. Others claimed the fog itself bore shapes when the bell tolled, twisting into cloaked forms that vanished at dawn. The innkeeper's daughter confessed to Mrs. Lark that she had dreamt of the monk beckoning from the tower with a hand made of bone. But more sinister were the resurgent murmurs of the relic, a stolen object of holy origin, hidden long ago in the church's vaults and said to curse any who dared touch it. The name of the Turner family, whispered with sympathy one day, was muttered with suspicion the next. Holmes listened to it all without reaction, noting patterns of fear with the same dispassionate attention he might apply to ash upon a sleeve. "Fear," he remarked to me one evening, "is a contagion that spreads faster than fire, but unlike fire, it requires no fuel, only imagination." Still, there was no denying it. Something beneath this village's skin had begun to rot. It was on the 5th night after our arrival that the bell tolled once more. I had been seated in the Turner's parlour, offering what comfort I could, when the sound began, slow, heavy, and unmistakably real. The girl's mother gasped aloud, her knitting tumbling from her lap. The father stood as if struck. I myself felt an involuntary chill run the length of my spine. I hurried outside. Others had done the same. Villagers gathered in 2s and 3s near the edge of the churchyard, staring upward in frozen silence. The tower loomed dark and still, yet the bell gave its measured cry as though struck by some spectral hand. No light shone from the church. No figure passed beneath its windows. When at last the tolling ceased, the hush that followed was more dreadful than the sound itself. Holmes emerged from the far side of the lane, his coat drawn close and eyes narrowed. He said nothing then, but I knew him well enough to mark the change. The stillness that came over him before a net was cast. The villagers, however, could not see it. They saw only fear confirmed. At first light, Holmes returned alone to the church. I followed at a respectful distance, for I had learned in such moods that he did his finest thinking in solitude. He moved with great care around the altar, sprinkling a fine dust from a small pouch he had carried in his coat. He waited, then examined the patterns the powder formed, how it settled, where it clung, where it did not. A narrow crescent near the rear corner remained untouched, as if something had pressed it down. He traced it with a gloved finger. A hinge beneath stone, he murmured to himself. Or a pressure plate, perhaps both. His eyes then drifted to the dais itself. He scraped a bit of residue from its edge, crumbs of wax, yes, but mixed now with what appeared to be fine grit. His nostrils flared slightly. "Charcoal dust," he said when I approached. "Recently handled." The air inside the nave had grown colder, though no window was open. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" I asked. He glanced up at the bell tower above. "Only that what masquerades as ritual may often be the machinery of crime." And he returned to his task. Later that same day, Holmes requested access to the parish archives, housed in a locked cabinet within the vestry. Reverend Arkwright, though pale and hesitant, obliged us with a heavy iron key. The books were many, some so old that their vellum bindings cracked at the touch. Holmes turned the pages with delicacy, yet with a purposeful speed, like a surgeon probing a wound. "Here," he said at last, pausing at a volume from 4 decades past. The registry had been kept with admirable consistency until a sudden break, a gap of nearly 2 years, during which no marriages, no baptisms, no burials were recorded. The ink resumed abruptly, in a different hand. "Strange," I remarked. "Surely even the smallest parish must record its dead." Holmes nodded. "Particularly during those years, the tail end of the cholera outbreaks." He scanned the margins. And yet no mention of any relic, donation, or structural work done within that span. He closed the book. "It is not merely superstition that has been passed down here, Watson. It is a mission. Someone erased a chapter from this church's memory, and I believe that chapter was written in fear." Holmes wasted no time. Back at the inn, he penned a short but precise telegram to one Inspector Raxley of the Museum of Ecclesiastical Antiquities in London. It read, "Request full record of saint. Eligius reliquary circa 1860 to 1875. Note any thefts, disputed acquisitions, or documented curses. Emphasis on link to plague burials. Urgent. S. Holmes." The telegram was dispatched immediately via the village office, and Holmes remained by the fire in thoughtful silence. He did not speak for nearly half an hour, save to remark once, "The mind, Watson, may forget, but the paper, like the grave, remembers." I noted how his fingers tapped lightly upon his knee, an unconscious rhythm that only surfaced when a solution was forming just beneath his reach. Later that afternoon, I paid a second visit to the Turners. I found Mr. Turner alone in the parlour, nursing a pipe with a weariness that went deeper than fatigue. It was then he confided something he had kept from us earlier. "My father-in-law," he said, "passed 2 months ago, a farmer. Not wealthy, but he left behind land, more than some expected." I frowned. "You suspect contention?" He nodded. "There was a cousin, George Randall, estranged. Hadn't spoken to the family in years. But just after the funeral, he reappeared, asking after wills, boundaries and such. Alice heard him shouting one night outside the window. 'Why didn't you mention this before?' I thought it had no bearing on her vanishing. But now—" He broke off, eyes moist. I returned to Holmes with the news, which he received with a slow nod. "Greed," he said, is a seed that grows best in silence. That evening, as the fog pressed close against the windows of the inn, I found myself again seated near Mrs. Lark's hearth. She told me, in the low tones of one passing on sacred blasphemy, the story in full. There was a reliquary long ago, said to contain a tooth of St. Dunstan, or his scourge, depending on who you asked. They brought it from a ruined abbey in Sussex. From that day, deaths followed. She looked over her shoulder. Then it vanished. Some say it was buried. Others that the monk who stole it was bricked alive behind the altar. I could not help but shiver. It curses the hands that move it, she said. And now, the bell tolls again. Outside, the wind wept along the eaves. That night I found Holmes walking alone beneath the twisted yews of the churchyard, hands clasped behind his back. He did not speak for a time. At last, he said softly, "Fear, Watson, is the most obedient of servants when ambition calls." "You believe someone is exploiting the superstition?" I asked. "More than that," he replied. "They are orchestrating it. The bell is no ghost. It is a summons." "To what end?" He did not answer at first. Then, "The question is not who hears the bell, but who it signals." And with that, he turned once more toward the church, his silhouette vanishing into the trees as the clock struck the quarter hour. It was on a grey and shivering morning, one in which the village seemed to hold its breath, that the second blow fell. I had gone to the post to inquire after Holmes's awaited telegram, when a runner from the northern hamlet burst into the square, his words nearly unintelligible in his haste. Another girl, Sarah Elmsley, aged 10, had vanished in the night. Within the hour, the entire village had gathered in stunned silence outside her home. The girl's mother, a pale and trembling woman who could scarcely speak, was being comforted by neighbours. The girl's bed had not been slept in. The window, though latched from within, bore the faint imprint of an oily hand. I found Holmes kneeling just outside the cottage garden, examining the soil. "No broken branches," he observed, "no forced gate, and yet her footprints end at the hedgerow, abruptly, as though she had stepped into air." He rose slowly. "2 disappearances. Same hour, same silence. This is no longer an isolated act." There was fear in every eye, but also something darker now. Anger, suspicion, a desire to blame. Holmes turned to me with a quiet gravity I had seldom seen. "The pattern tightens, Watson. The veil is lifting, but before it rises fully, someone may yet perish beneath it." As the village reeled in horror, a hurried search was mounted under Holmes's direction. While most villagers combed the woods and lanes, Holmes directed a small group to the church once more. It was there, beneath the steps of the bell tower, long sealed and rusted, that they found it. A shawl, blue and frayed at the edge, lay half buried beneath the brambles by the tower's stone base. Holmes examined it with careful hands. There were 3 notable markings: a smear of ash at the hem, hardened drops of wax near the fringe, and a single loose thread caught upon the lower rung of the ancient ironwork. "Sarah's," said the vicar, pale with dread. "Her mother knitted it last winter." Holmes studied the ground about the tower, his brow furrowed. The padlock still hung in place, untouched. No new scuff marked the earth, no sign of ascent or descent. He held the shawl delicately, like a message written in pain. "This," he said softly, "was placed, not dropped." And I saw then, in Holmes's face, that the machinery of his mind had begun to move with frightening speed. By afternoon, the village's fear had twisted into something far more volatile. Rumour flew faster than fact. Some cried witchcraft, others claimed the dead had risen, and a few muttered of old sins never buried. At the centre of it all stood the Reverend Arkwright. He emerged from the chapel steps to address the crowd, but before he could speak, shouts erupted. A woman threw a stone, striking his arm. Another man, red-faced with grief and drink, bellowed that the vicar had brought damnation upon them all. The mob swelled and surged toward him. I stepped forward to intercede, but Holmes was faster. He mounted the church steps with astonishing force. "Enough!" he cried, his voice cracking through the chill like a whip. The crowd stilled. Arkwright, pale as marble, stared at Holmes as though seeing him anew. "You seek a devil," Holmes continued, "but rage is no compass. You will not find your children in fire and blood." There was silence then, ashamed, uncertain. Holmes turned to me with a look of weary resolve. "The time for shadows is over," he said. "Tonight, we draw the truth from the bell itself." That evening, Holmes summoned the vicar and myself to the sanctuary. "I have seen all I need," he said. "But to prove it, to tear away the veil, we must provoke the mechanism to act." He instructed Arkwright to spread word that the church would be unlocked that night, under the pretense of prayer. In truth, it would serve as bait. "To stand idle is to be complicit," Holmes said to the vicar. "Let those who would stalk the night believe we are asleep to their methods." We agreed to accompany him in the vigil. By dusk, the doors stood open, and the church lay in solemn stillness, like a stage awaiting its players. Holmes moved through the nave with measured steps, adjusting shadows, testing echoes, setting his trap not with rope or snare, but with silence and certainty. And thus, we waited, for the bell and the answer it would ring. We three took our places in the cold sanctuary shortly after 11. The pews loomed like silent sentinels, and the stained glass offered no comfort in the moonless dark. A single taper burned near the altar, casting long, spectral shadows upon the stone. Holmes sat nearest the chancel rail, unmoving save for the slow rise and fall of his breath. The vicar knelt a few paces away, lost in silent prayer. I, seated midway down the aisle, clutched my cane with knuckles white. The air grew colder, the kind of cold that sinks into bone, not wind, but absence. Then, just after the clock marked midnight, the bell rang. It was no illusion, no echo of memory. It rang, deep, sonorous, and full. Holmes did not flinch, but a flicker of movement caught my eye. He had vanished. I turned, half rising, but no sound marked his departure. Only the tolling continued. The vicar clutched the rail, trembling. We waited, breath held in the grip of some ancient terror. At last, the bell ceased, and footsteps echoed softly from the vestry beyond. Holmes reappeared as silently as he had vanished, emerging from the side chapel with the taper in his hand, and a look upon his face that I had seen only a handful of times in our long acquaintance. It was a look not of triumph, but of sorrow sharpened into clarity. "The path is laid bare," he said quietly. "The bell, the missing children, the vanished relic, they are threads of the same tapestry, Watson, and I have now seen the hand that weaves it." The vicar, his voice hoarse, asked, "What have you found?" But Holmes only shook his head. To speak now would spoil the trap. Let those who think themselves clever return once more to their pattern. Tomorrow, we catch them in it. He turned and extinguished the taper, plunging the sanctuary into darkness. As we stepped out into the cold, Holmes paused at the gate. "There is a mechanism of guilt," he said softly, "just as there is one for bells. Both, when struck rightly, cannot help but ring." And with that, he walked ahead into the fog, leaving only silence in his wake. The following morning, Holmes summoned me to the rear of the inn, where a low wall separated the yard from the dew-glazed moor beyond. He stood in his overcoat, hands buried deep, his gaze cast not at the horizon, but inward, his mind clearly absorbed in its own intricate landscape. "I believe I owe you a clearer account, Watson," he began, his voice low and deliberate. "Though I required the veil of silence last night, it has now served its purpose." I inclined my head and waited, for I had long learned never to interrupt him once the engine of his deduction had fully engaged. "The bell," he said, "is no more haunted than this bench. It swings because it is made to swing, by a system of levers and counterweights, likely antique in origin, likely concealed beneath the altar. It would require neither a rope nor a visible presence, only pressure upon a hidden mechanism. What fools the eye is its invisibility, not its impossibility." I listened, enthralled, as he went on. "There is a route beneath the church, a passage, I suspect, originating in monastic times. It has been used, recently and repeatedly, by someone who understands both its history and its symbolism. This is not a haunting, it is a performance, with a precise, mechanical stage." And with that, he turned back toward the church with long, decisive strides. Holmes's feet echoed softly across the flagstones of St. Elias as he motioned me forward. We stood before the altar, flanked by time-worn wooden rails and the familiar lingering scent of candle smoke and cold stone. He knelt and ran his fingers once more along the joints of the dais. "Observe this groove, Watson, barely visible to the casual eye, but irregular in the stone's wear pattern." With the end of his walking stick, he pressed lightly upon a particular quadrant near the altar's left base. There was a faint click. A segment of the floor, no broader than a grave slab, shuddered slightly upward. Holmes pushed, revealing a narrow shaft descending into darkness. Iron rungs gleamed faintly within. "This," he murmured, "was not built in haste. It is old, well used, and recently disturbed." He handed me a cloth-wrapped candle and struck a match. "Take heart, my friend. The ghosts of this place are not of spirit, but of memory, and we are about to meet one face to face." I confess, my blood chilled more from anticipation than cold as we stood over that gaping mouth in the floor, awaiting dusk. Holmes lit his pipe and resumed pacing as the vicar and I looked on, the afternoon light slanting across the pews like blades. "Let us now turn from fear to intent," he began, his tone that of a lecturer, but never unkind. "What if the bell were never meant to terrify, but to summon? Not a harbinger of doom, but a signal, audible, unmistakable, and time-specific." I frowned. "A signal to whom?" Holmes smiled faintly. "To an accomplice, or perhaps to the village itself. The midnight toll is not random, it is coordination, a precise note in a larger orchestration." He retrieved a folded scrap from his coat, a hand-drawn map of the church and grounds, marked with ink notations. The pattern of disappearances, the placement of clues, all point not merely to misdirection, but communication. The bell is the link. A message only the right ears would understand. The vicar paled. "You believe there are two?" "At least. And if we do not intercept their next rehearsal," Holmes said gravely, "the final act may yet be tragic." That evening, Holmes outlined his plan with the precision of a military strategist. "The church must remain unlocked," he said. "We shall make no announcement, no hint of a trap. Let it appear that our interest has waned. Fear makes poor bait, but neglect, that draws even the cautious out of hiding." Villagers were instructed, under the guise of casual invitation, to remain near windows and open doors. A few were asked to wander the lanes with lanterns, as though searching once more in vain. Holmes and I would wait within the church itself, concealed near the altar in total darkness. "The key," he said, "is silence. No whisper, no motion. They must believe they are alone. And if they do not come? Then we wait another night. But they will come, Watson. The bell demands its answer." He prepared a coil of cord, a small lantern, and a pistol, which he offered to me with a steady hand. I took it with some reluctance, sensing that the hour ahead would be no ordinary confrontation. And thus the sanctuary became a trap not of violence, but of vigilance. As midnight approached, the world seemed to still around us. We were seated in the sanctuary's shadowed depths, Holmes crouched motionless near the dais, his features barely visible in the weak spill of moonlight through the clerestory. My heart thudded with the slow, irregular cadence of dread. Holmes, by contrast, might have been carved from stone. He whispered once, almost inaudibly, "The bell tolls not for legend, Watson. It tolls for action." Then nothing. A church mouse scurried across the nave. Somewhere in the distance, a fox barked, and then, precisely at the appointed stroke, gong. The bell rang out, deep and resonant. Holmes did not move, but I caught it, the faint scrape of stone on stone near the altar, and a sudden breath of cold air rising from below. Holmes's hand clenched around the rope in his palm. The game at last was afoot. Out of the gaping shaft beneath the altar rose a figure. Cloaked and hooded, it emerged with unnatural grace, as if born of the shadows themselves. The flicker of a concealed lantern briefly illuminated a face half obscured, a pale jaw, hollow cheek, eyes glinting with purpose. He reached into his cloak and produced something metallic, an object wrapped in dark cloth. With great care, he placed it beneath the chancel rail, then turned to ascend the pulpit stairs, likely intent on planting yet another token of dread. Holmes moved then, not with noise, but with finality. "Not another step," he said aloud, and the figure froze as though struck. I rose, my pistol drawn, heart racing. The man turned slowly. The hood fell. "Elias Whitaker," Holmes intoned, not with surprise, but recognition. "You have told your last lie." The former bellman stood trembling, the weight of guilt and discovery settling on his shoulders like the dust of the tombs he had disturbed. And in that still church, echoing with the memory of stolen bells, the truth began to surface from the depths, at last. The moment hung in silence, as though the very stones of St. Eligius held their breath. Holmes stood rigid, a silhouette etched against the flickering lantern light. Before him, Elias Whitaker made no move to flee, nor to resist. His hands hung limp at his sides, and his eyes, though shadowed by the cloak's hood, gleamed with something that was not fear, but a strange and hollow resignation. Holmes reached forward and gently drew back the hood. The man beneath was aged beyond his years, cheeks sunken, hair streaked with grey, the gaunt lines of long suffering etched deeply into his features. "Mr. Whitaker," Holmes said quietly, "the bell has tolled, but the hour belongs to truth now." The man gave a strangled laugh, low and bitter. "Truth? What good is truth to a man already buried in silence?" Holmes stepped aside, gesturing toward the altar. "Let us speak where the lies began." And so it was that the sanctuary, once the stage for illusion, now became the place of confession. I followed close behind, noting how Elias moved not like a captured criminal, but a man who had, in some weary corner of his soul, been waiting to be found. Seated upon the front pew, Elias Whitaker stared at the floor as though the flagstones themselves might accuse him. His voice, when it came, was low and rasping, yet within it lay the crackle of long-held bitterness. "I kept that bell true for 25 years, he began, every chime a part of my spine. It tolled for births, for deaths, for Sundays when the village still believed in something." He glanced up at the dim cross above the altar. "Then they took it all from me, said I was too slow, that my leg wasn't right after the accident, replaced by a younger man with clean boots and no memory of what this place once meant." He spat the words like ash. "They made me a ghost long before I gave them one." Holmes said nothing, allowing the confession to unspool. "My wife died soon after. No coin for doctors. The vicar prayed over her and left, just like that bell, just like the lot of them." A long pause. "So I gave them back their fear, only louder." There was no bravado in his tone, only the dull weight of grief weaponized into resentment. Holmes folded his arms. watching Whitaker with a gaze that was neither condemning nor sympathetic, only piercing. "You manipulated superstition," he said, "and turned it into strategy." Whitaker gave a crooked smile. It wasn't hard. The stories were already here. The monk who hung himself from the belfry, the cursed relic. All I did was ring the bell. They filled in the rest. He gestured vaguely toward the vestry. "That old place has more secrets than sins. The bell mechanism. Just a counterweight rig I rigged beneath the dais. Took weeks to build, crawling in the dark. But when it rang at midnight and no man stood near the rope, that was enough." "And the purpose?" Holmes prompted. "To make them flee," Whitaker replied. "Fear hollows a town better than fire. Once folks started whispering of hauntings and curses, houses went for pennies. A man with some money saved, quietly placed through a solicitor, could buy half the hollow in a fortnight." Holmes nodded slowly. "So you became your own legend." Whitaker lowered his eyes. "A ghost with deeds in his name." It was grotesque in its cunning, but undeniably clever. Holmes's eyes narrowed, his voice low but clipped. "And the girls?" Whitaker's facade cracked, just slightly. "Unharmed," he said at once. "I swear it." "You abducted them," Holmes said coldly. "To what end?" "To scare, not to harm. Their vanishings were meant to quicken the villagers' flight. And their families, they'd stay quiet, do anything, if they believed it meant the child might return." "And were they held here?" Whitaker nodded toward the side of the sanctuary. "Vestry crypt, dry and secure. I left food, blankets, spoke to them through the shaft, told them it was a game, that no harm would come." "And the accomplice?" Whitaker's jaw clenched. "Gone. Took fright when the girl's shawl was found. Fled before tonight." I felt a chill settle in my spine, not only from what had been done, but from what might have happened had Holmes not intervened. Holmes turned to me. "Fetch the vicar. The girls must be released immediately. Let this tale end with breath, not gravestones." And I ran faster than I had in years, toward the vestry and the breath of innocence, long held in fear. With the church now quiet and the children safely delivered to their tearful kin, Holmes remained beneath the chancel, drawing a small sketchbook from his coat. "You deduced it all?" I asked. "The shaft, the mechanism, even Whitaker?" He tapped the tiled dais with his cane. "Observe these 3 tiles, Watson, worn not from footfall, but from pressure. A man kneeling in prayer would not apply weight so regularly, but one returning nightly to reset a mechanism. That leaves a signature." He moved to the shaft's edge. "The air, too, note how it rises faintly, a sure sign of a hollow beneath. I smelled lye and wax, both substances with ceremonial or mechanical utility." "And the bell?" "Counterweighted," Holmes replied. "The lever rests here, beneath this hollow groove in the altar base. When pressed, it releases a pendulum-weighted bar fixed to the bell's wheel." I stared down the shaft, marveling at the ingenuity and the cruelty alike. "And the legend?" I asked. Holmes sighed. "The perfect disguise. Where reason falters, myth thrives." We stood in silence as dawn crept through the stained glass, and in that silence, I understood what Holmes had known all along. This case had wrung the darkest chord in the human heart. Fear, finely tuned. It was with a sense of weary relief that I found myself once more within the familiar embrace of our rooms at 221 B Baker Street. The rain-lashed shadows of Darnley Hollow had faded into the grey light of London, and the flickering hearth before me offered not only warmth but perspective. I could not say whether it was the comfort of Mrs. Hudson's tea tray or the quiet certainty of Holmes seated opposite me, violin untouched upon his lap, that gradually coaxed the tension from my limbs. For several long minutes, we spoke not a word. Holmes's gaze was fixed upon the coals, his fingers steepled in silent contemplation. It was only when the carriage wheels outside had faded into silence that he stirred. "Well, Watson," he said at last, "the bell has ceased its mourning." I nodded, uncertain whether the remark was literal or poetic. He turned his gaze to me then, not unkindly, and added, "You have questions. I have answers. Let us trace the sound back to its first swing." Thus, the long arc of mystery began its return, one measured step at a time, toward the anchor of reason and justice. Holmes rose and retrieved his notebook from the mantel, flipping it open to a page marked with hastily drawn diagrams, lines intersecting at odd angles, weights noted in grams, pulleys crudely sketched beside Latin inscriptions. It was all beneath their feet, he said. The altar had been altered, fittingly enough. A pressure plate, cleverly concealed beneath the central stone. When trod upon, it activated a concealed rod affixed to a counterweight housed behind the chancel wall. He gestured in the air, as though seeing it again. A simple lever mechanism redirected the energy upward through a narrow conduit, one still connected to the bell's axle despite the absence of a rope. It would not suffice for regular peals, but for a solitary, ghostly toll in the dead of night, it was more than enough. I marvelled as ever at the cold ingenuity behind the deception. It was not merely showmanship, Holmes continued. It was engineering masquerading as the supernatural, and in such a setting, sacred, silent, it required little embellishment. What man, he added softly, would challenge a ghost when he dare not challenge a priest? The logic was irrefutable and chilling. It was never merely the tolling of a haunted bell, Holmes continued, his voice low. It was language. He tapped a series of notations in his book. 3 tolls meant to approach, 2 to hide, 1 to act. Whitaker and his accomplice communicated thus from opposite ends of the village. The bell, situated above all eyes, became their codebook. I felt a sudden chill. Every fear it stoked was real, but not for the reasons believed. While the villagers spoke of spectres, Whitaker dispatched his partner to secure deeds, to deliver notes of extortion, to spread whispers that served their ends. It was misdirection raised to artistry, Holmes concluded. An entire village made deaf to reason by one well-placed sound. My thoughts turned at once to the children, the innocent lives caught in the machinery of this cruel artifice. They were beneath the vestry, Holmes confirmed, a bricked-over crypt once used in plague times, accessible only through a narrow shaft and concealed by shelving. They were unharmed? I asked urgently. Physically, yes, Holmes replied. Emotionally, only time shall tell. Whitaker was careful. Food left through a chute, messages delivered in gentle tones. He told them it was a test of obedience, that their families would be proud if they remained quiet. The audacity of it, twisting a child's trust into silent captivity, turned my stomach. It was never about harming them, Holmes said, only using them. Their disappearance was calculated to unmoor the families, to drive desperation to its breaking point. And the accomplice? I asked. Fled, Holmes said shortly. Cowardice is a common consequence of conscience poorly stitched. I stared into the fire. In its crackle, I fancied I heard the echo of that dreadful bell, ringing still in the corridors of innocence. You recall the relic? Holmes asked, his tone light, almost amused. The cursed reliquary of St. Ambrose, I said, frowning. The villagers believed it stolen decades ago and blamed it for every misfortune since. Precisely, Holmes replied. A myth seeded into fertile ground. Whitaker revived the tale, encouraged whispers, and ensured the bell's tolls aligned with its supposed curse. He flipped another page in his notebook. No such object ever existed in the parish records. The entire legend was a local fabrication, one used now to deflect attention from what lay beneath their feet. I exhaled. So even their fears had been stolen. Holmes inclined his head. Fear is rarely original, Watson, but it is easily recycled. Superstition, Holmes said, rising from his chair and moving toward the window, is a kindling wood of marvelous potential. It requires only a small spark, then stands back and watches men burn their reason upon it. He stood there in silence, gazing out at the fog-drenched street. Whitaker understood his parish. He knew they would not question the sacred, nor investigate the seemingly divine. He traded in reverence, Watson, and profited. He turned to me then, and there was a gravity in his expression that I rarely saw. To manipulate machinery is one thing, but to manipulate belief, that is a darker art. His words lingered long after he resumed his seat. I find I cannot shake it, Holmes, I confessed at last. Not the crime itself, but the ease with which symbols meant to comfort were twisted into instruments of fear. Holmes studied me quietly. The altar, the bell, the very church itself, tools of reassurance, yet in the hands of one embittered soul, they became accomplices to deceit. He nodded once. We give symbols power, Watson, and so long as men fear shadows more than facts, such symbols shall remain vulnerable. A knock sounded at the door then, a note from Reverend Arkwright, who wrote to thank us. The bell, he said, would be restored, this time to summon not dread, but solace. Holmes opened his violin case and drew the bow across the strings, the low notes curling through the air like smoke. As I sat back in my chair, the melody washing over me, I realized that truth, like music, needs no witness to exist. It simply endures. It was upon a Tuesday morning, grey and slow to rouse, that I found Holmes standing before the window of our sitting room at Baker Street, his silhouette limned faintly against the pall of fog that clung to the panes. The streets below, half shrouded in that peculiar London mist, were as indistinct as the motives that had brought misery upon Darnley Hollow. He did not speak nor stir at my approach. His gaze, I believe, was not fixed upon the passing world, but turned inward, retracing perhaps the thread of logic that had unravelled a tapestry woven from dread and deceit. Outside, the muffled sound of hoofbeats echoed, distant and ghost-like, and I could not help but recall the toll of that ropeless bell, suspended in memory like a note struck but never resolved. Though the case had closed, and justice, in its measured tread, had caught its quarry, a residue remained. Not upon Holmes, for his mind, once exercised, seldom lingered on sentiment, but upon myself, who had witnessed not merely the crime, but its erosion of trust among the innocent. In that fog beyond the window, I saw not merely weather, but remembrance, dissolving slowly into silence. Holmes spoke at last, his voice quiet but distinct, as though addressing not myself, but the drifting veil of vapour beyond the glass. Superstition, my dear Watson, is not born of malice, but of absence, an absence of light, of understanding. It is the shadow cast where knowledge dares not tread. He turned then, his expression composed, yet touched with something weightier than mere deduction. Men fear what they do not examine, and there are always others, men like Whitaker, eager to exploit that fear. They do not need weapons, only a bell and a myth. I nodded, uncertain whether it was agreement or resignation. He resumed his seat, folding his hands over one knee. It is no feat to trick the senses, but to puppet the soul with strings of legend, that is a more insidious craft. His words lingered long after the fog had begun to recede. In that moment, I grasped the greater peril Holmes had unmasked, not the scheme, nor even the man behind it, but the soil from which such things grow. Ignorance, when cultivated, becomes fertile ground indeed, for tyranny draped in tradition and cruelty masked in faith. Later that same afternoon, as I sat penning notes in the margin of my journal, a knock announced the arrival of a letter. The handwriting upon the envelope was instantly familiar, precise, reverent, and tinged with the formality of clerical hand. Holmes opened it without ceremony, though I leaned forward with quiet anticipation. It was from Reverend Arkwright. The vicar's words were earnest and filled with gratitude. He wrote of the slow reweaving of calm within his parish, of sermons once more delivered, without eyes darting toward unseen corners, and of mothers allowing their children beyond the threshold with cautious hope. He spoke of Alice and the other girl, of how their recovery, though marked by tremors of memory, was already brightened by familiarity and the resumption of ordinary things. One sentence caught Holmes's attention. He read it aloud. "We have decided to restore the bell, not to ring at midnight in dread, but at morning light to welcome the living." Holmes folded the letter carefully, returning it to its envelope. "Good," he said simply. It was all he needed to say. As I lay the letter aside, I found myself reflecting upon the curious transformation that time, coupled with truth, can effect. Darnley Hollow, once cloaked in whispers and suspicion, now seemed to stand upon the threshold of something finer, a slow resurrection of reason. I imagined the villagers gathering once more beneath the nave's high arch, the sun filtering through age-stained glass, illuminating familiar faces grown strange through weeks of fear, the pews reclaimed, the prayers restored, and above all, the bell, silent no more, not a harbinger of terror, but a summons to begin again. Holmes, for all his dispassion, had wrought more than revelation. He had sown the seeds of recovery. His was not merely a detection of crime, but a redirection of a village's course, a pulling back from the brink of collective despair. And I had borne witness. For all our adventures together, it was not the dangers I remembered most, but the aftermaths, the quiet reckonings, the soft return of order, the moments when the world exhaled. Hope, I had learned, rings loudest not in triumph, but in return. With evening descending and the fire crackling low in the grate, Holmes stood, as if roused from reverie, and crossed to where his violin rested. He drew the bow gently across the strings, not in concert, but in meditation. The notes that followed were low and sparse, simple tones, drawn from some remote corner of thought, neither mournful nor celebratory, but suspended in a kind of reflective stillness. I had heard Holmes play in triumph and in mockery, in stimulation and in boredom, but now he played as if translating the unspoken. It was the music of ambiguity, and in that moment I felt the gap between us, not in friendship, which remained firm, but in temperament. Where I sought meaning, he sought clarity. Where I brooded, he simply understood. The final note drifted into silence. Holmes set down his instrument, and the case was closed. That night, long after Holmes had retired to his room, and the embers in the hearth had faded to sullen glow, I remained awake, pen in hand. I thought of the bell, the symbol it had been, the power it had wielded, and the fragile return of its innocence. It is a delicate boundary, I have come to believe, between faith and fear. One inspires the better angels of our nature, the other opens doors to shadows, and yet both wear the same vestments, speak in the same tongue, and echo from the same spires. In silence, that boundary is crossed. I looked once more to the window, to the quiet veil that still wrapped the street, and found no comfort in its familiarity. But I knew this much. So long as reason has champions, however few, the bell may yet ring for truth. and I shall remain, as ever, its witness." Holmes leaned back in his chair, the glow of the hearth painting angular shadows across his thoughtful face. The final note of his violin lingered like a question left unanswered in the smoke-thick air. "A curious thing, Watson," he murmured, "how the simplest contrivance, a counterweight, a hidden shaft, can hold dominion over the minds of an entire village when cloaked in the vestments of superstition. Fear, you see, needs no rope to toll its bell." I stared into the embers, uneasily reminded of how close hysteria had come to consuming reason. "Still," I said at last, "one wonders what drove Whitaker to such lengths." Holmes turned, his eyes unreadable. "Bitterness unmoored from purpose is more dangerous than madness, my friend. It requires no lunacy, only a belief that justice has failed. What do you think was Whitaker's greatest mistake? Was it underestimating Holmes or overestimating the power of fear itself? Let us know what you believe in the comments. And if you enjoyed this mystery, be sure to subscribe for more cases from the world of Sherlock Holmes, and share this tale with friends who love a shadowy puzzle. The next mystery may be closer than you think.